My name is Alex Thompson, and I needed a job. Badly. After getting laid off from my gig at the local hardware store, apparently, people are fixing things themselves less and less these days. My savings were dwindling faster than I was comfortable with. I'd sent out countless resumes, applied to everything from fast food to data entry, but the universe seemed determined to keep me unemployed. That was until I saw the ad in the Help Wanted section of the local paper, part Time Assistant Needed, Serenity Falls Funeral Home. My initial reaction was a mix of morbid curiosity and a slight shudder. Working at a funeral home, it wasn't exactly my dream job. But rent was due, my fridge was looking alarmingly empty, and frankly, options were running out. I figured, how bad could it be? People die, and someone has to take care of the arrangements. It's a necessary service, even if it's a little creepy. The next day, I found myself standing in front of Serenity Falls Funeral Home. The name itself was a bit on the nose, but the building was surprisingly unassuming. It wasn't the Gothic mansion I'd half expected. Instead, it was a 2-story, white clapboard building with dark green shutters and a well-maintained lawn. It looked more like a doctor's office than a place where people said their final goodbyes. A discreet sign with elegant, silver lettering simply read, Serenity Falls Funeral Home, Respect, Dignity, Remembrance. Taking a deep breath, I walked up the short path to the front door and rang the bell. A few moments later, the door was opened by a tall, thin man with neatly combed grey hair and kind, albeit slightly wary eyes. He wore a dark suit that looked impeccably tailored. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm and gentle. "You must be Mr. Thompson." "Yes, that's me," I replied, extending my hand. "Alex Thompson. I'm here about the assistant position." "Ah, yes. Please." "Come in," he said, stepping aside. "I'm Mr. Abernathy, the owner and director here at Serenity Falls." I followed him into a small, tastefully decorated foyer. The walls were painted a soft, calming blue, and there were a few antique chairs and a small table with a vase of fresh white lilies. It was quiet, almost eerily so. There was a faint, almost imperceptible scent in the air, something like flowers mixed with a hint of something else I couldn't quite place. Mr. Abernathy led me into a small, wood-panelled office. He gestured for me to sit in a comfortable leather chair opposite his large mahogany desk. The office was filled with framed photographs, mostly of families, presumably those who had used the funeral home's services. There was also a framed diploma on the wall, certifying Mr. Abernathy's credentials as a licensed funeral director. "Thank you for coming in, Thompson," Mr. Abernathy said, settling into his own chair. "As you know, we're looking for a part-time assistant to help with various tasks around the funeral home. This would include things like answering phones, assisting with paperwork, maintaining the appearance of the facilities, and occasionally assisting with viewings and services." He went on to describe the hours, which were flexible, but would likely include some evenings and weekends. The pay wasn't amazing, but it was enough to keep me afloat. As he spoke, I tried to imagine myself actually doing this job. Could I handle being around death on a regular basis? The thought was unsettling, but the desperation for employment outweighed my reservations. "Do you have any experience in this field, Mr. Thompson?" Mr. Abernathy asked, his eyes meeting mine. "No, sir, I don't," I admitted. "My background is mostly in retail." Mr. Abernathy nodded slowly. "That's all right. We're willing to train the right person. What we're really looking for is someone who is reliable, respectful, and has a calm and compassionate demeanor. This is a sensitive business, and it requires a certain level of understanding and empathy." I assured him that I possessed those qualities. I'd always been a fairly level-headed person, and I genuinely cared about helping others. Even in this unusual context, I felt I could rise to the occasion. "Well, Thompson," Mr. Abernathy said after a few more questions about my availability and general work ethic, "I have a good feeling about you. How would you feel about starting tomorrow?" I was a little taken aback by the sudden offer, but relief washed over me. "I would be very grateful for the opportunity, Mr. Abernathy." "Thank you. Excellent," he said, a faint smile gracing his lips. "Come by at 9 in the morning, and I'll show you around and get you started." I left Serenity Falls Funeral Home feeling a strange mix of apprehension and gratitude. I had a job. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't what I'd envisioned for myself, but it was a job. And right now, that was all that mattered. The next morning, I arrived at the funeral home feeling a bit more nervous than the day before. This was it. This was my new reality. I was greeted by Mr. Abernathy, who seemed just as calm and composed as he had been during the interview. "Good morning, Alex," he said, ready to get started. "Yes, sir," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Mr. Abernathy began by giving me a tour of the facilities. The The ground floor consisted of the foyer, his office, a small arrangement room where families could meet to discuss funeral plans, and 2 viewing rooms. These rooms were tastefully decorated with soft lighting, comfortable seating, and closed caskets draped with elegant fabrics. They felt strangely peaceful, despite their intended purpose. He then took me to the back of the building, which housed the embalming room, a small prep area, and a garage where the hearse was kept. The atmosphere back here was noticeably different. It felt colder, more sterile. The air had a faint, metallic scent that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. This is where the more technical aspects of our work take place. Mr. Abernathy explained, his voice matter of fact. You won't be directly involved in this, but it's important for you to be aware of it. I nodded, trying not to dwell on what exactly happened in the embalming room. My imagination was already running wild with images I'd seen in movies. Finally, Mr. Abernathy led me downstairs to the basement. The stairs creaked ominously as we descended into the dimly lit space. The basement was surprisingly large, with concrete walls and a low ceiling. It was mostly used for storage, filled with boxes, old furniture, and various pieces of equipment. In one corner, however, I noticed a heavy, steel door with no handle or visible lock. It looked out of place, almost like something you'd find in a bunker. "What's behind that door?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. Mr. Abernathy paused for a moment, his expression becoming slightly more serious. "That's private. Nothing for you to worry about, Alex. Just storage." His tone was firm, and I decided not to press the issue. There was something about that door and his reaction to my question that made me feel uneasy. Over the next few days, I settled into my new routine. My tasks were mostly as Mr. Abernathy had described. I answered phones, scheduled appointments, helped families with paperwork, and made sure the public areas of the funeral home were clean and presentable. The job was certainly different from anything I'd done before. There was a constant awareness of death in the air, a quiet solemnity that permeated everything. But surprisingly, I found that I was able to handle it. The families I interacted with were usually grieving and vulnerable, and I found a sense of purpose in being able to offer them a bit of comfort and support during a difficult time. Mr. Abernathy was a kind and patient boss. He was meticulous in his work and had a deep respect for the deceased and their families. He taught me the proper etiquette for dealing with grieving individuals and the importance of maintaining a professional and respectful demeanor at all times. However, as the days turned into weeks, I started to notice some odd things. Small things at first, things I could almost dismiss as my imagination playing tricks on me due to the nature of the job. For instance, I would occasionally hear faint noises coming from the basement, even when Mr. Abernathy wasn't down there. It sounded like shuffling or dragging, but it was always muffled and indistinct. When I asked Mr. Abernathy about it, he would simply say it was the old building settling or the wind outside. Then there were the rules. Mr. Abernathy had given me a list of guidelines to follow, which seemed reasonable enough at first. Things like always being punctual, dressing professionally, and speaking in a respectful tone. But as time went on, he started adding more specific and frankly stranger rules. One day, he told me that I should never, under any circumstances, go into the basement after dark. "It's just not safe down there at night, Alex," he'd said, his eyes holding a strange intensity. "There are unstable structures." Another rule was that I should never open the door to the embalming room unless Mr. Abernathy was present. "That room contains sensitive equipment and chemicals," he explained. "It's for your own safety." These rules were a little odd, but I didn't think too much of them at the time. I figured Mr. Abernathy was just being cautious and protective. But then came the really strange rules, the ones that made the hairs on my arms stand up and a knot of unease form in my stomach. One afternoon, Mr. Abernathy called me into his office. He closed the door and sat down behind his desk, his expression serious. "Alex," he began, his voice low, "I need to talk to you about something very important. Something that is absolutely crucial for you to understand while working here." I leaned forward, my heart starting to beat a little faster. "There are certain protocols we follow here at Serenity Falls," he continued, "protocols that are not standard in the funeral industry. These are in place for reasons." He paused, looking me directly in the eye. "The first rule, and this is paramount, is that you must never, under any circumstances, speak to the deceased." I blinked, taken aback. "Speak to the deceased? You mean when they're in the casket?" Mr. Abernathy nodded gravely. "Yes. Never speak to them, not even a word, not even in jest. It is absolutely forbidden." "But why?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. "It's simply the rule, Alex," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Just promise me you will never do it." I hesitated for a moment, 1,000 questions swirling in my mind. But Mr. Abernathy's serious demeanor and the strange intensity in his eyes convinced me that this was not something to be taken lightly. "Okay," I said slowly. "I promise I will never speak to the deceased." "Good," he said, seeming slightly relieved. "There are other rules as well, but we'll go over them as they become relevant. Just remember this one, Alex. It's the most important." Over the next few days, I found myself constantly thinking about that rule. Why would it be so important not to speak to a dead body? It seemed absurd. They couldn't hear you, could they? But the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I became. There was something about the way Mr. Abernathy had said it, the almost fearful look in his eyes, that suggested there was more to it than just a quirky company policy. Then came the second strange rule. One evening, I was working late, cleaning up after a particularly large funeral service. Mr. Abernathy had already left for the day, telling me to lock up when I was finished. As I was tidying up one of the viewing rooms, I noticed that the casket in the room next door was slightly ajar. The room was supposed to be empty, as the viewing for that particular individual had been earlier in the day, and the body had been moved to the crematorium. Curiosity getting the better of me, I carefully pushed the door open and peered inside. The casket was indeed empty, but something else caught my eye. On the small table next to the casket, where memorial cards and guest books were usually placed, there was a small, antique-looking bell. It was made of tarnished silver and had an intricate carving of what looked like a weeping angel on its side. As I reached out to touch it, I heard a faint creaking sound behind me. I quickly turned around, but there was no one there. Just the empty room and the closed door leading to the hallway. Shrugging it off as my imagination, I turned back to the bell. It was beautiful, in a morbid sort of way. As I picked it up, I noticed a small note tucked underneath it. It was written in elegant cursive on a piece of aged parchment. I unfolded the note and read the words scrawled on it. "If you hear the bell ring after midnight, do not answer it." A shiver ran down my spine. What did that mean? Why would a bell be ringing in an empty funeral home after midnight? And why shouldn't I answer it? Just then, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text message from Mr. Abernathy. "Alex, I forgot to mention one more thing. If you happen to find a small silver bell in one of the viewing rooms, please leave it where it is. Do not touch it, and certainly do not ring it. It is very important that it is not disturbed." My blood ran cold. He knew about the bell, and his message only amplified the sense of unease I was feeling. I carefully placed the bell back on the table, exactly where I had found it. I didn't want to disobey Mr. Abernathy, especially after his cryptic warning. The rest of the evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak of the old building, every rustle of leaves outside the window, made me jump. I finished my cleaning as quickly as possible, double-checked that all the doors were locked, and practically ran to my car. That night, I had trouble sleeping. My mind was racing with questions about the strange rules and the mysterious bell. What was going on at Serenity Falls funeral home? What secrets was Mr. Abernathy hiding? And what was behind that heavy steel door in the basement? I knew one thing for sure. My new job was turning out to be much more than just a way to pay the bills. It was becoming increasingly clear that there were some very strange things happening at Serenity Falls, and I had a feeling I was only just scratching the surface. I decided that I would keep my eyes and ears open. I would follow Mr. Abernathy's rules, no matter how strange they seemed, but I would also try to figure out what was really going on. I had a bad feeling about this place, a feeling that went beyond the natural creepiness of working in a funeral home. There was something darker at play, and I was determined to uncover it. The next day, I went to work with a renewed sense of caution. I greeted Mr. Abernathy as usual, trying not to let on that I had seen his text message or the bell. He seemed his usual calm and collected self. As the day went on, I found myself paying closer attention to everything around me. I noticed small details I had previously overlooked. The way Mr. Abernathy would sometimes glance nervously towards the basement door. The faint, almost imperceptible scent that seemed to linger in the air, especially in the back rooms. The hushed tones he would sometimes use when speaking on the phone. It was all adding up to a growing sense of unease. I felt like I had stepped into a strange and unsettling world, and I wasn't sure if I liked where it was going. And then came the third rule, the one that truly made me question everything. It was during a viewing. The family of the deceased, an elderly woman named Mrs. Gable, had gathered to say their final goodbyes. I was standing discreetly in the corner of the viewing room, making sure everything was in order. Mr. Abernathy was there as well, offering his condolences to the grieving family. The atmosphere was somber and quiet, punctuated only by the occasional sob. As I watched, I noticed Mr. Abernathy subtly place something in the pocket of the deceased woman's dress. It was a small, smooth, grey stone. I couldn't imagine why he would do that, and it seemed rather odd. Later that day, after the viewing was over and the family had left, I asked Mr. Abernathy about it. "Mr. Abernathy," I said hesitantly, "I saw you put something in Mrs. Gable's pocket during the viewing. What was it?" He looked at me, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he sighed softly. "That, Alex, was a river stone," he said. "It's part of another one of our protocols." "A protocol?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. "What's it for?" Abernathy hesitated for a moment, as if deciding how much to tell me. "It's a guide," he finally said. "For the journey." "A guide?" I repeated, confused. "What journey?" "The journey to the other side," he explained, his voice low and serious. "We place a river stone in the pocket of every individual who passes through our care." "Why?" I pressed. "It is said," Mr. Abernathy began, his eyes looking distant, "that the river between this world and the next is long and treacherous. The river stone helps to weigh the spirit down, to keep it from getting lost in the currents. It guides them safely to their final destination." I stared at him, my mind reeling. This was beyond strange. This was superstitious. "Do you really believe that?" I asked incredulously. "Mystery?" Abernathy looked at me, his gaze steady. "Whether I believe it or not is irrelevant, Alex. It is our way. It has been our way for a very long time." He didn't elaborate further, and I could tell he didn't want to talk about it anymore. But his words hung in the air, heavy with an unspoken history and a hint of something else. Something that felt ancient and unsettling. A river stone to guide the spirit. Not speaking to the deceased. A silver bell that shouldn't be answered after midnight. What kind of funeral home was this? I went home that night feeling more disturbed than ever. My initial curiosity had morphed into a genuine sense of unease, bordering on fear. I had taken this job out of desperation, but now I was starting to wonder if I had made a terrible mistake. What other strange rules were there? What secrets were hidden within the walls of Serenity Falls? And what was behind that heavy steel door in the basement? I knew I had to find out, even if it meant facing something I wasn't prepared for. My gut was telling me that there was more to this place than met the eye, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was slowly being drawn into something dark and inexplicable. The thought of quitting crossed my mind, but then I remembered my empty fridge and the looming rent payment. I was trapped, at least for now. So I decided to do the only thing I could. I would play along, follow the rules, and try to unravel the mysteries of Serenity Falls funeral home before it was too late. The next few weeks at Serenity Falls were a blur of routine tasks, punctuated by moments of unsettling strangeness. I continued to answer phones, assist with paperwork, and generally keep the place running. I even started to become more comfortable around the deceased, though I still couldn't shake the image of Mr. Abernathy placing that grey river stone in their pockets. The rule about not speaking to the deceased remained firmly in my mind. It felt unnatural, especially during viewings when families would often talk to their loved ones, sharing memories and saying final goodbyes. There were times when I felt an urge to offer a comforting word to the still figure in the casket, but Mr. Abernathy's stern warning always stopped me. The silver bell also remained a source of anxiety. I never saw it again after that first encounter, but the image of it and the note lingered in my thoughts. I found myself subconsciously listening for any unusual sounds after midnight, half expecting to hear its faint chime. Thankfully, the nights I worked late were uneventful in that regard. The basement door continued to be a silent, looming presence. Mr. Abernathy never mentioned it again, and I made sure to avoid even glancing at it directly. But my curiosity gnawed at me. What could be so important or so dangerous that it needed to be locked away behind a heavy steel door in the basement of a funeral home? One afternoon, while I was organizing some supplies in a storage room on the main floor, I stumbled upon an old, leather-bound book tucked away on a high shelf. It looked ancient, its pages yellowed and brittle. Curiosity piqued, I carefully pulled it down. The cover was blank, with no title or author. I opened it cautiously, and the first page I saw was filled with handwritten text in elegant, spidery script. The language looked old, almost archaic. I flipped through a few more pages, noticing that the book seemed to be some sort of journal or log. There were dates written at the top of some pages, going back decades, even centuries. Intrigued, I tried to decipher some of the text. I could make out a few words here and there, words like past, stone, silence, and the bell. It was difficult to understand the context, but the words themselves sent a shiver down my spine. It felt like I had stumbled upon something I wasn't meant to see. Just then, I heard Mr. Abernathy's footsteps approaching. I quickly closed the book and shoved it back onto the shelf, hoping he hadn't seen me with it. He entered the storage room, his expression calm as usual. "Everything all right in here, Alex?" he asked. "Yes, sir," I replied, perhaps a little too quickly. "Just organizing some supplies." He nodded and went about his business, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he sensed something. His eyes seemed to linger on the shelf where I had found the book for a moment before he turned and left the room. That evening, after Mr. Abernathy had gone home, I couldn't resist the urge to go back to the storage room. I retrieved the old book and carefully examined it again. I spent a long time trying to decipher the handwriting, and slowly, painstakingly, I began to piece together some of the entries. One entry, dated 1887, read, "The silence was broken tonight. Young Thomas spoke to her, a foolish boy. The consequences were swift and severe. The stone did not guide her, and the bell tolled for him." Another entry, much more recent, simply stated, "The river demands its due. The stone is placed. The silence must be kept." The more I read, the more disturbed I became. These entries seemed to refer to the rules Mr. Abernathy had told me about: the silence, the stone, and the bell. It was as if this book contained a history of the strange protocols of Serenity Falls. But what were the consequences of breaking these rules? What happened to the foolish boy Thomas? And what did the bell toll for? I knew I was treading on dangerous ground, but I couldn't stop myself from wanting to know more. This book held secrets, dark secrets, and I felt compelled to uncover them. The next day, I decided to try a different approach. I would try to engage Mr. Abernathy in conversation about the history of the funeral home. Perhaps he would reveal something without realizing it. During a quiet moment in the afternoon, while we were both in his office, I casually asked, "Mr. Abernathy, how long has Serenity Falls been here?" He thought for a moment. "Oh, it's been in the family for generations. My great-grandfather founded it back in the late 1800s. "That's a long time," I said. "Have there been many changes over the years?" He smiled faintly. "Some, of course. Styles change, technology advances, but the core principles remain the same." "And those principles include the river stones?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Mr. Abernathy's smile faded slightly. He looked at me with a hint of suspicion in his eyes. "Yes, Alex. As I explained, it's our way." I decided not to push it further for the moment. I had a feeling he was becoming wary of my questions. A few days later, something happened that I couldn't explain away with logic or coincidence. I was working late again, this time preparing a viewing room for a service the next morning. The room was empty, and I was just making sure the lighting was right and the memorial cards were in place. As I was adjusting a floral arrangement on a table near the casket, I heard a distinct whisper. It sounded like a woman's voice, soft and breathy, right behind me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I slowly turned around, but there was no one there. The room was empty. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling slightly. Silence. I told myself it was just my imagination, the stress of the job getting to me. But the whisper had sounded so real, so close. I tried to shake it off and get back to work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the room. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there. Then I heard it again. The same soft whisper, this time seemingly coming from the direction of the empty casket. I backed away slowly, my eyes wide with fear. This couldn't be happening. Suddenly, I heard a faint scratching sound coming from inside the casket. It was a soft, rhythmic scratching, like fingernails on wood. I didn't wait to hear any more. I turned and ran out of the viewing room, my legs moving faster than I thought possible. I didn't stop running until I was out of the funeral home and standing in the cool night air, gasping for breath. I stood there for a long time, trying to calm down and make sense of what had just happened. Had I really heard a whisper? Had there really been a scratching sound coming from an empty casket? I tried to come up with rational explanations. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe it was the old building settling. Maybe I was just tired and my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew what I had heard, and it terrified me. I didn't go back inside that night. I called Mr. Abernathy, telling him I wasn't feeling well and had to go home. He didn't question it, which I found a little odd. The next morning, I went back to work with a heavy sense of dread. I avoided the viewing room where I had heard the whisper and the scratching. I didn't want to go near it. Later that day, Mr. Abernathy called me into his office. He looked more serious than usual. "Alex," he said, his voice low, "I need to talk to you about something." My heart sank. I had a feeling this was about what happened last night. "Did anything unusual happen last night while you were working late?" he asked, his eyes searching mine. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to say. Should I tell him what I heard? Would he believe me, or would he think I was crazy? I thought I heard something, I admitted cautiously. In one of the viewing rooms. Mr. Abernathy's expression didn't change. He just nodded slowly. "What did you hear?" "A whisper," I said, "and then a scratching sound from inside the empty casket." He was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on something beyond me. Then he sighed softly. "Alex," he said, "I told you there are certain protocols we follow here, rules that must be obeyed." "I know, sir," I replied, "and I have followed them. I haven't spoken to anyone. I haven't touched the bell." "But you heard something," he said. "Something you weren't supposed to hear." "What was it, Mr. Abernathy?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What's going on here?" He leaned back in his chair, his eyes filled with a wariness I hadn't seen before. "This place, Alex," he began, his voice low and grave, "it's more than just a funeral home. It's a conduit. A place where the veil between worlds is thin." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process what he was saying. "Sometimes," he continued, "those who have passed on, they aren't quite ready to leave. They linger. They try to communicate. The whisper and the scratching," I stammered. He nodded. "It's rare, but it happens. That's why the rules are so important, Alex. To keep the balance. To prevent unwanted interactions." "Unwanted interactions?" I repeated, a chill running down my spine. "What kind of unwanted interactions?" Mr. Abernathy was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Some things are best left undisturbed, Alex. Some doors are better left closed." His words did little to ease my fear. In fact, they only made me more anxious. A conduit between worlds, lingering spirits, unwanted interactions. What had I gotten myself into? That night I had a vivid dream. I was in the viewing room, standing next to the empty casket. The silver bell was on the table beside it, and it began to ring, a soft, insistent chime. I reached out to touch it, but a cold hand grabbed my wrist, pulling me closer to the casket. I looked down and saw a pale, gaunt face staring up at me from the darkness within. The lips moved, forming words I couldn't quite hear, but the eyes were filled with an ancient sorrow and an unbearable hunger. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. The dream felt so real, so vivid. I couldn't shake the image of that face in the casket. The next day at work, I was on edge. Every shadow seemed to move, every creak of the building made me jump. I avoided the viewing rooms as much as possible. Mr. Abernathy seemed to sense my unease. He kept a close eye on me, his expression a mixture of concern and something else I couldn't quite decipher. Then came the fourth rule. It was late in the afternoon, and Mr. Abernathy called me into his office again. He closed the door and sat down, his demeanor more serious than I had ever seen it. "Alex," he said, his voice grave, "I need to tell you about another rule. This one is particularly important." I braced myself, wondering what other strange and unsettling guideline he was about to reveal. "There may be times," he began, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made me shiver, "when you are asked to stay here overnight. It is rare, but it can happen. If such a situation arises, you must under no circumstances leave the building until sunrise. Stay here overnight." I asked, my voice filled with apprehension. "Why?" "There are certain hours," he explained, his voice low and hushed, "when things are more active here. The veil is at its thinnest between midnight and dawn. It is not safe to be outside during those hours." "Not safe," I repeated, my fear growing. "What do you mean, not safe?" Mr. Abernathy hesitated, as if struggling to find the right words. "Let's just say," he finally said, his gaze unwavering, "that there are things that walk at night that are not meant to be seen by the living. Things that are drawn to places like this. Places where death is a constant presence." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "If you are ever here after midnight, Alex, you must stay inside. Lock all the doors and windows, and whatever you do, do not go outside until the sun has fully risen." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken dread. Things that walk at night, drawn to places of death. It sounded like something out of a horror movie. I swallowed hard, trying to process everything he had just told me. My job at Serenity Falls had gone from strange to downright terrifying. I was working in a place where the dead whispered, where unseen things scratched in empty caskets, and where malevolent entities roamed outside after midnight. I knew one thing for sure: I needed to get out of here. But the thought of facing the empty fridge and the overdue rent kept me rooted to the spot, at least for now. I promised Mr. Abernathy that I would follow this new rule, just as I had followed the others. But inside, my mind was racing. What kind of place was Serenity Falls? What other secrets were lurking in the shadows? And how much longer could I endure this growing sense of dread before it finally broke me? The weight of Mr. Abernathy's words settled heavily upon me. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind that rattled the windows, now sounded like the approach of something sinister. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, especially as dusk began to fall. The thought of unseen things lurking just beyond the walls of Serenity Falls, waiting for the cover of darkness, was enough to keep me on edge. Days turned into a tense routine. I performed my tasks with a sense of urgency, eager to leave before nightfall. I avoided any unnecessary trips to the back rooms or the basement, and the viewing rooms held a particular sense of dread for me now. The memory of the whisper and the scratching in the empty casket was still vivid and chilling. I tried to rationalize everything Mr. Abernathy had told me. Maybe he was just eccentric, a bit superstitious due to his line of work. But the fear in his eyes when he spoke of the nighttime hours felt genuine, and that scared me more than anything. One particularly stormy evening, Mr. Abernathy called me into his office. The wind howled outside, and rain lashed against the windows. He looked troubled. "Alex," he said, his voice strained, "I have a bit of a situation. We were expecting a transfer tonight, a body from the hospital, but the weather has made the roads treacherous. The driver called and said he won't be able to make it until morning." My stomach dropped. I had a bad feeling about where this was going. "I see," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Unfortunately," Mr. Abernathy continued, "I have a prior engagement tonight that I cannot reschedule. It's very important. I need someone to stay here and receive the transfer when it arrives, just to ensure everything is handled properly." He looked at me, his expression pleading. "Alex, would you be able to do that for me? I know it's late, but I wouldn't ask if it wasn't absolutely necessary." My mind screamed no. Stay here overnight, during the hours when the veil was thin and things walked in the darkness. The thought terrified me, but I also knew that I needed this job, and Mr. Abernathy looked genuinely desperate. "Okay," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I can stay." Relief washed over his face. "Oh, thank you, Alex. I really appreciate this. The transfer should arrive sometime between midnight and 2 in the morning. Just let them in and show them where to place the body in the prep room. Everything is ready." He gave me a set of instructions and a spare key, then hurried out into the storm. I was left alone in the silent funeral home, the wind and rain my only companions. As the hours ticked by, the atmosphere in the building grew heavier, more oppressive. The shadows seemed to deepen and stretch, taking on strange and unsettling shapes. Every creak and groan of the old building sent a jolt of fear through me. I tried to distract myself by reading, but I couldn't concentrate. My mind kept drifting back to Mr. Abernathy's warnings about the night. I kept imagining shadowy figures lurking outside, their eyes fixed on the funeral home. Midnight came and went. The storm raged on and the power flickered a few times, plunging me into momentary darkness that made my heart leap into my throat. I paced the floor, my nerves frayed. Around 1:30 am, I heard the rumble of an engine outside. Headlights swept across the front windows. The transfer had arrived. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart, and went to open the door. 2 figures in dark raincoats stood on the porch, struggling with a gurney. "Serenity Falls," one of them asked, his voice muffled by the wind and rain. "Yes," I replied, holding the door open. "Come in." They wheeled the gurney inside, and I led them to the prep room in the back. The body was covered by a white sheet, and I didn't get a good look at it. The transfer workers were efficient and professional, and they quickly secured the gurney in the designated spot. "All right, that's all set," one of them said. "Sign here, please." I signed the paperwork, and they were gone as quickly as they had arrived, disappearing back into the storm. I was alone again. It was almost 200 am, and the rest of the night stretched before me. I made sure all the doors were locked and the windows were secured, just as Mr. Abernathy had instructed. Then I retreated to the small break room and tried to wait out the remaining hours until sunrise. But sleep was impossible. Every sound the building made seemed amplified in the stillness of the night. The wind howled like a banshee, and the rain beat against the roof like insistent knocking. Around 300 am, I heard a faint sound coming from the basement. It was a soft, rhythmic thumping, like something heavy being dropped repeatedly. My blood ran cold. I remembered Mr. Abernathy's rule, never go into the basement after dark. But the sound was persistent, and my curiosity, mixed with a growing sense of dread, began to overwhelm my caution. I told myself it was probably just the wind or the old pipes. But the thumping continued, steady and deliberate. Against my better judgment, I found myself creeping towards the basement door. The stairs creaked ominously as I descended into the darkness. The air in the basement was cold and damp, and the faint, metallic scent I had noticed before was stronger here. I fumbled for the light switch and flicked it on. The single bulb hanging from the ceiling cast long, eerie shadows across the concrete floor. The basement looked much the same as I remembered it, filled with boxes and old furniture. But the thumping sound was louder now, and I could tell it was coming from the corner where the heavy steel door was located. My heart pounded in my chest. I slowly approached the door, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch the cold metal. There was no handle, no way to open it from this side. The thumping continued from behind the door, more insistent now. It sounded almost like someone was banging on it from the inside. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely a whisper. "Is anyone there?" Silence. Then the thumping started again, followed by a low, guttural moan that sent a shiver down my spine. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. What was behind it? What was making those sounds? Suddenly, I heard another sound, a faint scratching, this time coming from the far end of the basement. My eyes darted towards the sound, and I saw something move in the shadows. It was small and dark, and it seemed to be scurrying along the floor. I couldn't make out what it was, but the sight of it sent a wave of panic through me. I turned and fled back up the stairs, not stopping until I was safely back on the main floor, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I locked the basement door behind me and leaned against it, trying to calm down. What was going on in this place? The rest of the night passed in a blur of fear and paranoia. I stayed away from the windows, afraid of what I might see outside. Every sound made me jump. I huddled in the break room, counting down the minutes until sunrise. As soon as the first hint of dawn appeared in the sky, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The oppressive atmosphere in the funeral home seemed to lighten slightly. When Mr. Abernathy arrived later that morning, he looked tired but relieved to see me. "Thank you again for staying, Alex," he said. "I really appreciate it. Did everything go all right with the transfer?" "Yes, sir," I replied, trying to sound as normal as possible. Everything went smoothly. I didn't mention what I had heard in the basement. I wasn't sure if he would believe me, and frankly, I didn't want to talk about it. The memory of those sounds was still too fresh and too terrifying. But the events of the night had shaken me deeply. I knew now that there was something truly wrong at Serenity Falls. Something beyond the normal creepiness of a funeral home. Over the next few days, I found myself increasingly drawn to the old leather-bound book I had found in the storage room. I would sneak away during quiet moments and try to decipher more of its cryptic entries. One entry dated 1932 caught my eye. The bell rang thrice tonight. A restless spirit sought release. The stone was not enough. The door must remain sealed. Another entry, much older, read, "The river demands a toll." The silence was broken. The offering must be made before the moon wanes. These entries were disturbing and confusing. They seemed to hint at some kind of ritual or sacrifice. What was the offering? What happened if the door was open? And what was the significance of the bell ringing 3 times? My mind raced with possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. Was Serenity Falls not just a funeral home, but something else entirely? A place of dark secrets and ancient practices. I knew I had to find out more. I decided to try and find a way to open that steel door in the basement. Whatever was behind it, I had a feeling it held the key to understanding the strange rules and the terrifying events that seemed to be a part of life at Serenity Falls. One afternoon, while Mr. Abernathy was out, I went down to the basement armed with a small toolkit I had brought from home. The steel door looked as impenetrable as ever. There were no hinges visible and no keyhole. It was set flush against the concrete wall. I ran my fingers along the edges, searching for any kind of latch or mechanism. I tried to pry at it with a screwdriver, but it wouldn't budge. The door seemed to be sealed shut. Frustrated, I was about to give up when I noticed something I had overlooked before. On the concrete wall next to the door, there was a small, almost hidden inscription. It was etched into the stone, and it looked very old. I knelt down to get a closer look. The inscription was in a language I didn't recognize, a series of strange symbols and characters. It looked almost like some kind of ancient rune. I tried to take a picture of it with my phone, but the lighting in the basement was too poor. I decided I would try to sketch it out later. As I stood up, I noticed something else. On the floor near the door, almost hidden in the shadows, was a small, grey stone. It looked just like the ones Mr. Abernathy placed in the pockets of the deceased. I picked it up. It was smooth and cold in my hand. As I held it, I felt a strange sense of unease wash over me, as if the stone held some kind of dark energy. I quickly dropped it back on the floor. I didn't want to touch it anymore. I went back upstairs, my mind buzzing with questions. What was the meaning of the inscription? Why was the river stone there? And what secrets lay hidden behind that steel door? I knew I was getting closer to the truth, but I also felt like I was venturing into dangerous territory. The more I learned about Serenity Falls, the more I realized that this was no ordinary funeral home. There was something ancient and sinister at play here, and I was caught in the middle of it. I decided that I needed to find out more about the history of Serenity Falls. Maybe the local library or historical society could provide some answers. The next day, during my lunch break, I went to the local library. I searched through the archives and old newspapers, looking for any information about the funeral home. I found several articles about its founding in the late 1800s by Mr. Abernathy's great-grandfather. There were also some mentions of strange occurrences and rumors surrounding the place over the years. Whispers of unusual rituals, unexplained deaths, and a sense of unease that seemed to cling to the building. One old newspaper article from the early 1900s particularly caught my attention. It reported on the disappearance of a young boy who had reportedly broken into the funeral home late one night. The boy was never seen again, and the article mentioned rumors that his disappearance was linked to strange happenings at Serenity Falls. The article also mentioned a local legend about an ancient burial ground that was said to have existed on the land before the funeral home was built, a place where the veil between the living and the dead was said to be exceptionally thin. As I read these words, a chill ran down my spine. It all seemed to fit together: the strange rules, the whispers, the scratching, the steel door, the legend of the burial ground. Serenity Falls wasn't just a funeral home. It was a place steeped in history, a place where the boundaries between life and death were blurred, a place where ancient forces might still be at play. And I was working right in the middle of it. I went back to work that afternoon with a heavy heart. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was terrifying. I knew I couldn't stay at Serenity Falls much longer. The fear and unease were becoming unbearable, but I also felt a sense of morbid curiosity, a need to know the full truth about this place. As I walked through the silent halls of the funeral home that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The shadows seemed to deepen, and the air felt colder. I heard a faint creaking sound from the basement, and I hurried to lock up and leave, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew that my time at Serenity Falls was coming to an end. I just hoped I could get out before it was too late. Before I became another one of its secrets, the more I learned about Serenity Falls, the more suffocating the atmosphere became. The weight of its history, the whispers of the past, seemed to press down on me in the silent halls. I knew I couldn't stay much longer. The fear was a constant companion, gnawing at my sanity. One evening, I was working late, my nerves stretched thin. Mr. Abernathy had gone home early, leaving me to lock up. As I was tidying his office, I noticed the old leather-bound book lying on his desk. It was open to a page I hadn't seen before. Curiosity and a sense of desperate urgency overwhelmed my caution. I picked up the book and began to read. The entry was dated just a few weeks prior, written in Mr. Abernathy's familiar hand. The signs are growing stronger. It read, "The veil thins with each passing moon. The whispers are more insistent. The door it stirs. The offering must be prepared. The balance must be maintained." My blood ran cold. Offering. Balance. What was he talking about? I flipped through more recent pages. There were cryptic notes about lunar cycles, specific dates, and preparations being made. The language was unsettling, hinting at something dark and ritualistic. Then, I found an entry that made my heart stop. It was dated for the following night. "The time is near. The cycle is complete. The river demands its due. The chosen one will be ready. The stone will guide. The silence must be absolute. And the door will open. Chosen one." What did that mean? And the door opening. The steel door in the basement? A wave of nausea washed over me. I suddenly understood the fear in Mr. Abernathy's eyes, the urgency in his warnings. He wasn't just eccentric, he was involved in something truly sinister. I knew I had to get out of Serenity Falls, and I had to do it now. I quickly closed the book and placed it back on Mr. Abernathy's desk, trying to make it look as if it hadn't been touched. Then, I grabbed my bag and headed for the front door, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached the foyer, I heard a noise coming from the basement. It was the same rhythmic thumping I had heard the night I stayed overnight, but this time it was louder, more insistent. I froze, my hand on the doorknob. A morbid curiosity, a desperate need to know what was behind that door, held me captive. Against my better judgment, I found myself turning towards the basement stairs. I had to know, I had to see what was going on. The basement was even colder and darker than I remembered. The single light bulb flickered ominously. The thumping sound was deafening now, and it was clearly coming from behind the steel door. I approached the door slowly, my senses on high alert. The low, guttural moans I had heard before were also present, mixed with the frantic thumping. It sounded like something was trapped behind the door, desperate to get out. Then, I noticed something new. On the floor in front of the door, There was a fresh pile of grey river stones, identical to the ones Mr. Abernathy placed in the pockets of the deceased, and next to the stones, lying on the cold concrete floor, was the silver bell. A wave of dread washed over me. This was it. This was the night the book had spoken of, the night the door would open. Suddenly, the thumping stopped. The moans subsided. The basement fell silent, save for the faint humming of the flickering light bulb. I stood there, frozen in fear, my eyes fixed on the steel door. The silence was more terrifying than the noise had been. It felt heavy, expectant. Then, I heard a soft clicking sound. It seemed to be coming from the door itself. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the heavy steel door began to swing inward. The darkness beyond was absolute. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel a cold, stale air emanating from the opening. It smelled of damp earth and something else, something ancient and foul. A faint whisper drifted out of the darkness, barely audible. It sounded like my name, Alex. My blood ran cold. I knew I should run. I should get out of the funeral home as fast as I could, but my feet seemed rooted to the floor. I couldn't look away from the open door. Another whisper, closer this time. Alex, come closer. I took a hesitant step forward, my heart pounding in my chest. The darkness beyond the door seemed to beckon me, to pull me in. Just then, I remembered Mr. Abernathy's first rule, never speak to the deceased. The whisper came again, right in front of me now. Alex, we've been waiting. A cold, skeletal hand reached out from the darkness, its fingers long and bony. It brushed against my arm. I recalled in horror, finally breaking free from the trance. I stumbled backward, away from the open door, my mind screaming in terror. I turned and ran, not stopping until I was out of the basement and back on the main floor. I didn't even bother to lock the basement door. I just ran. I burst out of the front door of Serenity Falls and into the night. The storm had passed, and the moon hung high in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows. I ran down the street, my lungs burning, my legs atching. I didn't look back. I just kept running, putting as much distance as possible between myself and that place. I didn't stop until I reached my apartment, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. I locked the door behind me and collapsed onto my bed, trying to catch my breath. I lay there for hours, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the events of the night. The whispers, the hand reaching out from the darkness, it was all too real. I never went back to Serenity Falls funeral home. I didn't call Mr. Abernathy. I didn't pick up my last paycheck. I just disappeared. A few weeks later, I saw a small article in the local newspaper. It reported that Serenity Falls funeral home had been closed down indefinitely due to unforeseen circumstances. Mr. Abernathy was nowhere to be found. I never learned the full truth about what was going on at Serenity Falls. What was behind the steel door? Who was the chosen one mentioned in the book? What was the offering? I have my theories, of course. Dark theories that keep me awake at night. Theories involving ancient burial grounds, restless spirits, and a funeral director who was far more than he seemed. Sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I think I can still hear a faint whisper on the wind. It sounds like my name, and I always remember Mr. Abernathy's rules. Never speak to the deceased. Never touch the silver bell after midnight. Always place a river stone in their pocket, and never, ever, go outside after dark if you happen to be at Serenity Falls. Because there are things that walk at night, and some doors are better left closed. I still have nightmares about that basement, about the darkness behind the steel door, and the cold hand that reached out for me, and I know, with a certainty that chills me to the bone, that I got out just in time. I often wonder who the chosen one was supposed to be, and what happened when the door finally opened. Some questions are better left unanswered. Some secrets are best left buried, and some places should be avoided at all costs. Serenity Falls was one of those places, and I will never forget the strange and terrifying rules I had to follow while I worked there. Because the silence of the dead is not always peaceful. Sometimes, it's just waiting for you to listen.